March 9, 1945. The air above Tokyo tasted like ash before the first bomb even fell. Keiko Yamada pressed her palm against the shoji screen, feeling the cold seep through the rice paper. Outside, the city murmured, with its evening rituals, wooden clogs on stone, distant bicycle bells, the low rumble of factory shifts changing over. She was 17, and her fingers were stained black from the ink she'd been mixing all day at the printing house on Sumida Street. The smell clung to her skin, bitter and metallic, no matter how hard she scrubbed. Her younger brother Hiroshi knelt beside the low table, folding origami cranes with paper scraps their mother had saved from the ration notices. He was 9 years old and still believed in things like luck and protection. Keiko didn't have the heart to tell him otherwise. "How many now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 47, Hiroshi said without looking up. His small hands moved with practiced precision, each crease sharp and deliberate. "Mother says if I make 100, father will come home." Keiko's chest tightened. Their father had been conscripted 2 years ago and sent somewhere in the Philippines. The last letter had arrived 7 months back, just 3 lines, heavily censored, that said nothing at all. She knew what silence meant in wartime. Everyone did. But she couldn't take hope away from a 9-year-old boy whose eyes still lit up when he talked about baseball and summer festivals that would never come again. "Then, you'd better keep folding," she said, forcing lightness into her tone. The house around them was small, even by Tokyo standards, 2 rooms separated by paper screens, a narrow kitchen that barely fit 1 person, a shared privy in the alley behind. The walls were thin enough that they could hear the Nakamura family arguing next door, and the old widow Sato coughing on the other side. This was the Fukagawa district, where textile workers and day laborers lived packed together like matchsticks in a box. Keiko's mother, Yuki, emerged from the kitchen carrying 3 small bowls of rice, mixed with barley and a few strips of pickled radish. It was all they had. Rations had been cut again last week, and the black market prices had become impossible for families like theirs. "Eat slowly," Yuki said as she set the bowls down. Her face was gaunt, and new lines had appeared around her eyes, in recent months, worry lines that made her look a decade older than her 38 years. "There won't be more until tomorrow evening." They ate in silence, the way families did when hunger made every bite precious and conversation felt wasteful. Keiko tried not to think about the days before the war, when dinner meant laughter and full bowls, and her father's terrible jokes that made everyone groan. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, a different girl in a different world. Outside, the air raid sirens began their nightly test, a long, rising wail that made Hiroshi flinch despite himself. They'd grown used to it, the way people grew used to anything that happened often enough. But tonight, something felt different. Keiko couldn't name it, just a prickling sensation at the base of her skull, like the air before a lightning strike. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" Hiroshi asked, his voice small. "The Americans?" Yuki set down her chopsticks. "They've been hitting the factories. We're residential. There's nothing here worth bombing." But even as she said it, Keiko saw the doubt in her mother's eyes. They'd all heard the rumors spreading through the neighborhood, whispers about new tactics, about fire instead of explosives, about entire districts in other cities reduced to cinders in a single night. The government radio said nothing, of course. It never did. After dinner, Keiko helped her mother wash the bowls in a basin of cold water, while Hiroshi returned to his cranes. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, she could hear families settling in for the night, children being hushed to sleep, someone playing a shamisen with hesitant fingers, the shuffle of futons being rolled out across tatami mats. "I'm taking an extra shift tomorrow," Keiko said quietly. "Tanaka-san said they need help with the propaganda posters." Yuki's hands were still in the water. "You're already working 12 hours. We need the money. And it's just printing work. I'll be fine." Her mother didn't argue. They both knew there was nothing to argue about. You worked or you starved. Those were the only options left. By 10 o'clock, The household had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Hiroshi slept curled beneath a thin blanket, his collection of paper cranes lined up along the window ledge. Yuki had extinguished the lamp to save oil. Keiko lay on her futon, staring at the ceiling, and listening to the city breathe thousands of lives packed into wood and paper, fragile as moths. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, the sirens were screaming. Not the test sirens, the real ones. The sound that meant bombers overhead, danger imminent, move now or die. Keiko bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the paper screens, she could see searchlights, cutting white scars across the night sky. The drone of engines rumbled in the distance, low and ominous, growing louder with every passing second. "Mother!" she shouted, scrambling to her feet. Yuki was already moving, shaking Hiroshi awake with urgent hands. "Get up. Get up now. We have to go." "Where?" Hiroshi's voice cracked with sleep and fear. "The shelter. The school basement. Move." They had practiced this. Every family in Tokyo had practiced this. But practice was different from the real thing, the way your hands shook, the way your thoughts scattered like frightened birds, the way time seemed to slow down and speed up all at once. Keiko grabbed the emergency bag they kept by the door, a few rice balls, a canteen of water, and their family registry papers sealed in oilcloth. Hiroshi clutched his cranes, refusing to leave them behind. They stumbled out into the alley, joining the river of people already flooding toward the school 2 blocks away. The night had transformed. What had been quiet and dark was now chaos and light. Searchlights swept the sky. Anti-aircraft guns barked from rooftops. And above it all, that drone, dozens of engines, maybe hundreds, coming closer, closer, until the sound seemed to vibrate in Keiko's bones. Then she looked up and saw them. They weren't the high-altitude silver specks she'd imagined. These planes flew low, so low she could make out the shapes of their bellies, the dark rectangles of bomb bay doors hanging open like the mouths of hungry fish, and they were dropping something, not bombs, or not the kind she'd expected. Long, tumbling cylinders that caught the searchlights and glinted as they fell. They hit the rooftops, the streets, the wooden walls of houses with soft thuds that didn't sound dangerous at all, almost gentle. "Keep moving," someone shouted. But Keiko had stopped, transfixed by the sight of those cylinders splitting open, spilling their contents across the neighborhood. Small objects, tumbling end over end, bouncing off tiles and rolling into gutters. Then one ignited. A white-hot flare that turned night into day, magnesium bright and impossibly fierce. Then another. And another. Within seconds, dozens of them were burning, scattered across the district like fallen stars, firebombs. Yuki breathed. "They're dropping fire." The first house caught within moments, the Tanaka place, with its old dry timbers and paper walls. The flames didn't spread the way fire usually spread. They erupted, voracious and instant, consuming the structure in seconds. The heat hit Keiko's face like a physical blow, even from 50 feet away. More bombs fell. More houses ignited. The district was a tinderbox, and the Americans knew it. Wood and paper and centuries of architecture designed for earthquakes, not war. Every home has a potential torch. "Run!" Yuki grabbed both children by the arms and pulled them forward into the crush of bodies flooding the street. But there was nowhere to run to. Ahead, flames. Behind, flames. To the left, the canal, but it was already choked with people trying to escape the heat. To the right, more residential blocks, already burning. The world had become fire and smoke and screaming. The heat was the worst part. Not the flames themselves, but the waves of scorching air that rolled through the streets like breakers, stealing the oxygen from lungs and turning skin red and raw. Keiko's eyes streamed with tears that evaporated almost immediately. Her throat felt like she'd swallowed hot coals. They ran with the crowd, a river of humanity surging through streets that were rapidly becoming corridors of fire. The bombers kept coming, wave after wave, their engines a constant thunder overhead. More incendiaries tumbled from the sky, hundreds, thousands, until the district was carpeted in burning magnesium. Hiroshi stumbled, his paper cranes scattering across the street. He cried out and tried to turn back, but Keiko held him firm. "Leave them," she shouted over the roar of flames and collapsing buildings. "But father, he'd want you alive." They pushed forward. All around them, houses were transforming into pyres. The fire made its own wind, a howling vortex that pulled in air from all directions and sent embers spiraling into the sky like demonic snow. The smell was overwhelming, burning wood, burning fabric, and underneath it something else, something sweet and terrible that Keiko's mind refused to name. An elderly man collapsed in front of them, clutching his chest. People flowed around him like water around a stone. There was no time to stop, no space to help. You kept moving or you died. Those were the only choices. They reached the canal just as another wave of bombs fell. The water was already full of people, some swimming, others clinging to debris, still others floating face down in the current. The canal was supposed to be a fire break, a safe zone. But the fire had jumped it, leaping across on the wind, and now both banks were burning. The school! Yuki pointed east, toward a building whose concrete frame was still visible through the smoke. "If we can reach it." A building exploded behind them. Not collapsed, exploded, the fire so hot it had ignited everything flammable at once. The blast wave knocked Keiko off her feet. She hit the pavement hard, stars bursting behind her eyes. When she looked up, the street had become a tunnel of fire, flames reaching across from both sides to form a ceiling of heat and light. People were burning. Not just buildings now, but people. Their clothes caught first, then their hair, then their skin blistered and blackened, and they fell screaming or silent or already dead. Keiko watched a woman run past with her back on fire, slapping at the flames with hands that were also burning. A man tried to smother the fire with his jacket and caught fire himself. This wasn't war. This hell opened up and poured onto Earth. Yuki pulled Keiko to her feet. Blood ran down her mother's forehead from a gash at her hairline, but her eyes were clear and focused. "The canal. We have to get in the water." "But people are drowning." "It's water or fire. Choose." They half ran, half stumbled toward the canal bank. The heat was so intense now that Keiko's skin felt like it was shrinking, tightening against her bones. Her hair smoked. Her clothes were hot to the touch. They reached the edge just as the building behind them collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris. Yuki pushed Hiroshi in first, then Keiko, then jumped herself. The water was shockingly cold, a relief so intense it was almost painful. Keiko surfaced, gasping, and looked back at what had been her neighborhood. Gone. All of it, gone. In less than an hour, the entire Fukagawa district had transformed into a sea of fire. Every house, every shop, every temple and school and secret place she'd ever known consumed. The flames towered 30, 40, 50 feet high, feeding on themselves, generating their own weather system. Tornadoes twisted through the streets, columns of flame that danced and shifted with terrifying intelligence. Around her in the canal, hundreds of people clung to whatever they could find: wooden planks, discarded doors, each other. Some were burned so badly that Keiko couldn't tell if they were men or women, young or old. They just moaned and shivered in the water, shock setting in. A young mother floated past, one arm wrapped around a piece of debris, the other clutching a bundle to her chest. The bundle wasn't moving. The mother's eyes were open but empty, staring at something far away. "Don't look," Yuki said, pulling Keiko close. "Don't look at anything but me." But how could she not look? This was Tokyo. This was home. This was every memory she'd ever made turning to ash and smoke. The bombers kept coming. More fires bloomed across the city: Honjo, Asakusa, Sumida. From the canal, Keiko could see the entire eastern half of Tokyo burning, a wound of light against the night sky. The smoke rose in a column miles high, blotting out the stars. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the fire-lit darkness. Keiko's teeth chattered despite the burning air. Her body couldn't decide if it was freezing or boiling. Hiroshi had gone silent, his face pressed against Yuki's shoulder, his paper cranes dissolved to pulp somewhere in the water. "Look," someone nearby said. "The fire's spreading. East and west, the flames were advancing, pushed by wind and fed by an endless supply of wooden homes. The firestorm was creating its own wind patterns now, sucking in air from the outskirts and feeding it to the central inferno. The entire city was becoming a furnace. "We can't stay in the water," Yuki said. Her voice was hoarse from smoke and screaming. "We'll freeze to death." "We can't go back on land," Keiko replied. "We'll burn." They were trapped between elements, water or fire, freeze or burn. No good choices, only less terrible ones. Then Keiko remembered something. The stone bridge. The old one by Kiyosumi Garden. "The supports are concrete, if we can reach it." Yuki nodded, understanding immediately. "Can you make it that far?" Keiko looked at Hiroshi, at his pale face and chattering teeth. "We have to." They left the canal on the eastern bank, where the fires hadn't yet reached. The ground was hot enough to burn through shoe soles, and the air shimmered with heat. Bodies lay everywhere in the streets, on doorsteps, collapsed in mid-flight. Some were burned beyond recognition. Others looked almost peaceful, as if they'd simply lain down to rest and never woken up. Carbon monoxide poisoning, Keiko would learn later. The fire had stolen all the oxygen, and they'd suffocated where they stood. They moved in silence, picking their way through a landscape transformed into a nightmare. The streets were unrecognizable, landmarks. Keiko had known her entire life, the corner store where she'd bought candy as a child, the temple where she'd celebrated New Year, the park where she'd learned to ride a bicycle, all erased, just rubble and ash, and the twisted metal skeletons of what had once been homes. The heat was less intense here, away from the main firestorm, but it still felt like walking through an oven. Every breath scorched, every step was agony. Hiroshi had stopped complaining, which scared Keiko more than anything. The silence meant he was shutting down, going somewhere inside himself where the horror couldn't reach. They passed other survivors, ghost people moving through the ruins with blank faces. No one spoke. What was there to say? They'd all witnessed the same apocalypse. The bridge appeared through the smoke like something from a fever dream. Its stone supports had survived, though the wooden railings had burned away completely. Beneath it, the canal water reflected the orange glow of distant fires. A dozen people had already claimed shelter under the bridge, huddled against the concrete supports. They looked up warily as Keiko's family approached, animal instinct making them territorial even in disaster. "Please," Yuki said, "just for the night. We won't take much space." An old man with a burned face nodded slowly. "There's room, but the fire's coming this way. This might not hold." They settled against the cold stone, and Keiko finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion. Her muscles trembled, her lungs ached with every breath. When she closed her eyes, she saw flames and falling bodies, and the silver bellies of B-29s dropping their terrible cargo. But she couldn't sleep. None of them could. They sat in silence, listening to the fire consume the city. It roared like a living thing, hungry and endless. Sometimes they heard screaming in the distance, sometimes just the crash of buildings collapsing. As dawn approached, the bombing finally stopped. The engines faded into the distance, heading back toward wherever they'd come from, but the fire kept burning. It would burn for another day and night before exhausting its fuel. When the sun rose, it was dim and red through the smoke. Keiko climbed out from under the bridge and looked at what remained of Tokyo. Nothing. Almost nothing. As far as she could see in every direction, there was only devastation. A flat plain of ash and rubble, punctuated by the occasional standing wall or chimney. Here and there, small fires still burned, feeding on the last scraps of combustible material. The smoke was so thick, it turned the sun into a pale ghost. She thought about the printing house where she'd worked. Gone. The Nakamura family's home. Gone. The widow Sato. The school, the market, the shrine, all gone. A city of millions reduced to ash in a single night. Hiroshi emerged from under the bridge and stood beside her, his hand finding hers. Together they watched the sun struggle to break through the smoke. "Where do we go now?" he asked. Keiko had no answer. They waited under the bridge until midday, when the fires had died down enough to make movement possible. Then they began the long walk toward the western districts, where rumors said the damage was less severe. The journey took hours. They had to detour constantly around collapsed buildings and streets blocked by debris. Bodies lay everywhere, twisted into impossible shapes by the heat. Keiko tried not to look at faces, tried not to wonder who they'd been. At an emergency aid station set up in a park that had somehow survived, they received rice balls and water. Red Cross workers moved through the crowds with blank efficiency, triaging the injured, covering the dead. A young doctor with haunted eyes looked at Yuki's head wound and applied a bandage. "How many?" Yuki asked. "How many died?" The doctor shook his head. "Tens of thousands. Maybe more. We won't know for weeks." The final count would be nearly 100,000 dead in a single night, more than any other air raid in history. But they didn't know that yet. Standing in the ash-covered park, with the smoke still rising, they found temporary shelter in a school gymnasium in Shibuya, which had been converted into a refugee center. Hundreds of people lay on the floor, wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing. The smell of smoke and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. Keiko helped distribute food, needing something to do, some way to feel useful. She met a woman who'd lost her entire family husband, 3 children, parents, all gone. The woman spoke in a flat monotone, describing how she'd been at work in a factory when the bombing started, how she'd run home to find nothing but ashes and a few bone fragments that might have been her children. "I should have been there," the woman said. "I should have died with them." Keiko had no comfort to offer. What comfort was there? She squeezed the woman's hand and moved on. Over the following days, the true scale of the disaster became clear. The firebombing of Tokyo had destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Over 250,000 buildings were gone. 1 million people were homeless. The hospitals were overwhelmed with burn victims, many of whom would die in the coming weeks from infection and shock. And it wasn't over. The bombers came back on April 13th, then again in May. More districts burned. More people died. The city that had stood for centuries was being systematically erased. But Keiko's family had survived that first night, and that counted for something. They were alive. They had each other. In a world where everything else had been taken away, that meant everything. 6 months later, October 1945, the war was over. Japan had surrendered. American soldiers walked the streets of Tokyo, handing out chocolate to children who'd spent years being taught to fear them. Keiko stood in what had been the Fukugawa district, though nothing remained to mark it as such. The rubble had been cleared away, leaving only flat earth and the foundations of buildings. Soon, reconstruction would begin. New homes would rise. The city would be reborn. But the ghosts remained. She could still see the streets as they'd been, the houses where families had lived, the exact spot where she'd dropped into the canal. The memories were burned into her mind as permanently as the scars on her mother's hands. Hiroshi appeared at her side, now 10 years old, and more serious than any child should be. He held a paper crane, perfectly folded from clean white paper. "I finished the 1,000, he said quietly. "It took me all this time, but I finished." "Did father come home?" Keiko asked, though she already knew the answer. Hiroshi shook his head. Word had finally reached them 2 months after the surrender. Their father had died in the Philippines in early 1945, months before the fire. His body had never been recovered. "But I made them anyway," Hiroshi said. "For everyone. For the Nakamuras and Widow Sato and all the others." He released the crane, and the wind caught it, carrying it up and away over the ruins. They watched it disappear into the bright autumn sky. Keiko thought about all the paper windows that had burned that night, all the fragile walls that had offered no protection, all the lives that had been as delicate as origami, crushed and scattered by forces beyond their control. But paper could be folded again. New walls could be built. Life persisted, stubborn and resilient, even in the aftermath of fire. They walked back toward the refugee center that had become their temporary home. Tomorrow, Yuki had found work at a hospital. Next week, Keiko will return to school. Life continued, changed forever, but still moving forward. Behind them, the sun set over Tokyo, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would always remind her of that night. But mixed with those colors now was gold, the gold of autumn leaves, of new beginnings, of a future that hadn't existed 6 months ago. She reached for her brother's hand, and together they walked toward whatever came next.